Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is a lecture on externalities. And in particular, it's a lecture on solutions to externality problems that we didn't cover in the last time. Okay, so this is Externalities 4C, and this is Econ 441, Public Economics. Now, last time we talked about the Pigovian solutions to externality problems. Pigovian subsidies to handle positive externalities, Pigovian taxes to handle negative externalities. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the other possibilities. So, but mostly we're going to spend our time talking about an idea developed by Ronald Coase, an idea basically that won him the Nobel Prize. So I thought I would spend a mini lecture on that idea. So if you think about externality problems more broadly, these are spillover costs or benefits that are imposed by one group's activities on some other group, by and large. And in many cases, the spillovers are basically pretty small, and you could ignore them without much consequence. So, for example, the way people dress in class. That has an effect on other people in the room. Of course, that's part of the reason you dress the way you do. You want to present a certain kind of image or make a certain impression on other folks. So I guess you could say, to the extent that you want a positive image, then you're conferring a positive externality on other folks. On the other hand, if you want to stand out as some kind of nonconformist or somebody who doesn't care about style or doesn't care about you, that could be the clothing that you wear is, generating a negative externality. In most cases, it's probably a mixture because some people like what you wear and other people don't. But nonetheless, there's an externality problem there, but it's not really worth the trouble to try to deal with it. Right? We regard this domain of personal freedom to be important enough that we won't fool around with trying to address externality problems in those areas, except for team sports and things of that sort, where everyone dressing more or less the same makes it easier for fellow team members to identify one another. So first type of approach to dealing with an externality problem is do nothing. Okay, it's too much trouble, not worth the cost. Benefits and net benefits that you would gain by addressing it are too small to be worth the cost. Second possibility would be the Pigovian one, so the tax and regulatory solution. As you would ask the government to intervene in some way, alter incentives so that people change their behavior and change their behavior in the right way. And if you've done it in an ideal sense, you'll have designed a perfect Pigovian tax or subsidy. Third possibility would be direct regulation. You just say, you do this, right? You mandate certain types of behavior to deal with an externality problem. So to some extent, some of the masking rules can be regarded as a regulation that tries to force people to wear a mask because of positive externalities that are associated with mask wearing, at least when you're dealing with with very infectious diseases that are transmitted through droplets and so forth coming out of your mouth and nose. The fourth possibility is the one we're going to spend today's lecture on, and that is that the parties affected could get together and negotiate a solution. Now you might say, well, that's crazy. You can't do that. Well, why? I mean, you can bargain over all kinds of things when you go shopping or when you form contracts with one another or with employers and so forth. So why not here? Well, in fact, you can do it. And for some types of externality problems, as I mentioned, I think in the previous lecture, it's only Coasian solutions that work. Okay, so the Coasian idea is that, well, if people can get together and bargain, if transactions costs are low, so that it doesn't consume resources to get together and engage in the negotiation process, and if contracts are binding, not as a civil law system is assuring that contracts are followed, then in principle, groups can get together and solve externalities directly through negotiations, and they can do it in a way that makes everyone better off. In that sense, it's analogous to an idea we'll be developing in the next block, of course, of the course on public goods, dealing with Lindahl solutions. And this, as you'll see when you look through the next block of lectures. So let's draw an externality problem and go through Coase's reasoning. So you've got some demand curve, some supply curve, some external marginal cost. And left to its own devices, the market outcome will be here. Because of the positive prediction being made that the externality problem is one that participants in the market will routinely ignore, right? So in effect, the positive claim, the positive prediction coming out of this choice setting assumes that people have not internalized a don't impose externalities on other folks norm and behave accordingly. And if they have, then that prediction won't be right, and the market outcome will actually be closer to the ideal, and in the limit would be perfectly ideal, simply because people have internalized the right kind of norms, and those norms affect their behavior. So the models always start with this positive prediction that people who are not forced to or induced to will typically ignore spillover costs and benefits that fall on third parties outside the groups directly involved here. Where here the groups directly involved are the consumers and the firms selling the stuff. Okay, so we could characterize the ideal level of this activity by adding the two cost curves together to get the social marginal cost curve. And again, we're taking the vertical sum of those two curves. And this will be the social marginal cost curve. And this will be the ideal level of the service or activity here. Okay, so now we aren't going to try to use public policy to reach this point under the Coasian assumption. We're just going to assume that the people get together and bargain. And the idea is that you can use this marginal external cost curve to characterize the amounts that the folks outside, the third parties, are willing to pay to have this externality problem addressed. Right? So their willingness to pay for reductions at Q, well, that's the activity level, at Q star, is that vertical height. Now, it's actually useful to remember that that vertical height should be the same as that vertical height if you've drawn the diagram right. Okay, that will be useful in demonstrating, as you'll see in just a few minutes, demonstrating that the Coasian outcome is the same one that you would get under an ideal Procopian tax. So now what would it take to get firms and consumers to reduce their activity level? Well, that's their surplus, right? The surplus is, between the two of them, is the vertical height between the demand curve and the supply curve, right? That combines the extra profit and extra consumer surplus together to get the extra social net benefit generated by a 1 unit change in quantity. At any Q you'd want to pick. So notice that that's where supply equals demand. The minimum amount required to get the firms and consumers to cut back is 0, right? Because they're actually equal. There's no surplus earned on that last unit. If you move back towards 0 in this direction, you can see that the amount required gets larger and larger and larger, right? Because you have to compensate firms and consumers for the reduction in consumer surplus. Notice also that as you move back towards zero, the quantity, or the amount that the folks affected, the third parties, would be willing to pay, gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And that's just because of the slope of the curves, the way I've drawn them. That part isn't critically important. This part actually is more important. Well, as long as this vertical height is bigger than this one, there are gains to trade, right? This group, the third parties, can compensate firms and consumers for their loss of profits and social and consumer surplus that they bear when they cut back on this activity. And that continues to be true until this height is exactly the same as that height, right? So when the demand curve is exactly MCX above the supply curve, that's going to be the last point in this particular diagram, where the third parties, the people who are bearing the extra cost but not getting any of the surplus from this market, are willing to pay exactly what it takes to get these guys in the market to cut back. And that's where the bargain ends, right? There are no further gains from trade between these two groups and the third parties. So notice that implies that you will move to here. Right, this height, which is the last offer made by the third parties, winds up being the same as that height. Well, why do we know that? Well, because we got this red line by adding this curve to the supply curve. And at this particular quantity, it turns out that the red line is exactly that distance. Well, I'm just going to call it O prime. The offer made by the third party group, O prime, at Q double star. That is exactly equal to the height above, to the extent to which the demand curve is above the supply curve at that point, right? And that's from the geometry of how we got this social marginal cost curve. So Coasian gains to trade run out, or are all realized, at Q star star. So that means that you don't necessarily have to have government intervene to solve negative externality problems. Now, again, remember the assumptions here. The assumptions are that these groups have no transactions cost. That means they can get together and bargain and coordinate their kind of negotiations with the other parties without cost. Obviously, that's not very realistic in many cases, right? Especially if you deal with a whole market where there's millions of consumers and thousands of firms. Getting all those people together would be quite difficult, right? So the Coasian solution becomes less practical as transactions costs go up. It also requires the bargaining to be binding in a sense, right? So once you've struck a bargain, you have to know that it's going to be executed. Otherwise, there'd be uncertainties and there'd be strategies in making these offers, and it's possible that not all the gains to trade would get realized. Cases where this is a reasonable strategy are small numbers cases. Suppose a neighbor of yours is having a big party. You don't care for their choice of music, or it's too loud, you want to sleep, whatever. And you can go over next door and say, could you please turn down the volume? And a neighbor might do that just out of goodwill. Or if you're in the Coasian world, he would do that if you compensated him or her for his lost surplus from the loud music adequately. And what that compensation might be would be, maybe just some kind of, bring over a tray of brownies or cookies or something of that sort, or it might be cash, right? You could just say, hey, here's $50. Go turn that thing down, please. I'd really appreciate it if you would. Right. So in small number setting, you can imagine these bargains taking place, and that it's certainly possible that the solution would be one that's optimal. In the sense of maximizing social net benefits. Now, notice that one of the things that's different about the Coasian solution and the Pagovian solution is that the guys who are harmed are actually paying the people harming them to reduce their activity level. They're compensating the other person, other groups, for losses they bear in moving from Q star to Q double star. And that's different than in the Pagovian sense. In the Pagovian case, the government intervenes with a tax and alters incentives for everyone and makes both these groups, the consumers and firms, worse off, right? Consumer surplus falls for consumers and the profits realized by firms fall, but makes these guys better off basically free of charge because they don't buy anything in this market. They just get the benefits from the reduction in external costs. So there's a distributional effect or difference between the two solutions. And of course, this produces no revenue that could be used for other things. Okay. On the other hand, this one, instead of making two groups worse off, actually makes everyone better off, right? After the compensation is paid, this group 3 is still realizing benefits, net benefits, because they paid less than the full amount of the costs that they were bearing before, less than they were bearing, than this reduction in costs that is achieved by moving from Q star to Q double star. And so they're better off, right? Even though they've had to pay money to get this to happen, the cost is worth it to them because they're getting an improvement in their living conditions that they wouldn't otherwise have. And the other two groups are being compensated for their loss of consumer surplus and profits. So in that sense, it's kind of a nice idea. And it turns out that it doesn't really matter from this Coasian point of view, in a diagram like this where there's a unique single social net benefit maximizing outcome, where you start. If you started over here at 0, where these guys controlled everything, then the other two groups would intervene and bribe this group to accept some damages, some harm, in order for them to be able to realize the profits and consumer surplus associated with this particular market, this particular activity. So that the fact that it doesn't matter who initially has control, whether the control initially is with the supply and demand guys, the market guys, or with the guys who would bear the cost of an unpleasant activity were it to take place. And that's very counterintuitive, and I think it's because of that counterintuitive idea that this is an idea deemed worthy enough to win the Nobel Prize. The other application for this is in settings where you can't rely on governments to do anything, such as the case when there are international externalities. When there are international externalities, really the only feasible way of addressing them is through some kind of Coasian contract. And we call those Coasian contracts treaties, right? Because these are voluntary agreements among nation states who are, at least hopefully, advancing the interests of their citizens through their bargaining efforts. And that's a small number setting. You've got representatives for these big groups back home sitting around the table working things out. And if they can find an agreement that makes everybody at the table better off, then the idea is that at least most people in their home countries are also better off. And this kind of resembles a Pareto superior move, a move that increases social net benefits for all the parties at the table, for the average person in each of the countries represented at the table. Now, of course, that's not always perfectly true for reasons we'll see when we get to the public choice section of the course. But nonetheless, it is how we address international externality problems, Coasian contract. So it's not just relevant for small numbers, kind of little problems in the neighborhood. It also includes globally relevant, large-scale problems that we might want to tackle in one way or another. And we don't have kind of a world government or something of that sort that can impose a particular tax or subsidy or regulation on the whole world. So with that introduction to the Coasian Contract, I'll stop this mini lecture. For more detail, as usual, take a look at the lecture notes that are available at the class website and backups of which are available at the eCampus site for the course. So see you next time.